Democracy, etymologically descendant from the Greek demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power, comes to mean that the people have power. Democracy is the most likely form of government philosophy that you, as a viewer of an English-speaking YouTube video, live under. And if you live in the English-speaking world, it has also therefore most likely been the governing philosophy of your nation for hundreds of years through varying capacity. Democracy, or at least democratic values, are understood as part of the Western world's identity, with it often being interpreted by many as the geopolitically insuperable line between us and them, between the West and the East. The US Department of State credits democracy with promoting fundamental human rights and American values. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stated,
"Our democracy is precious, something we have carefully grown and nurtured from one generation to the next."
Additionally, the vast majority of the world's working democracies are in Western nations, from Denmark to Ireland, whereas conversely the vast majority of the world's autocracies are in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, from North Korea to Saudi Arabia. Generally speaking, democracy is something which distinguishes us, separates us from the rest of the world. It is something which our society has accepted and practiced for, in some government systems, hundreds of years, and not to forget classical Athens, the cradle of Western civilization, is also the birthplace of direct democracy. Resultant from all of this, of course, is that democracy is readily accepted as the best way of distributing decision-making power fairly in a society, and many Westerners have never even considered the faults, demerits, and alternatives of democracy, and possibly never will. Majoritarianism, or majority rule, is defined as the practice of decision-making whereby an organized group makes decisions by way of the majority verdict. In practice, this is not distinct from the function of a working democracy. Of course, there are democracies which consider themselves to be consensus democracies, whereby there are means and measures to consider the concerns of the minorities in society. However, functionally, the end result in these consensus democracies is still democracy nonetheless. Still, the majority have the power, typically only with measly forfeits granted to minority positions, and thus, at its fundamental level, democracy is always going to be for the interest of the majority. This is an accepted fact, as obviously democracy is intended for this very function. However, this function should not be championed as it is. The position of championing democracy for being the rule of the many asserts that even in the unforeseeable future, the majority will continue to want rational, moral, economically, and socially advantageous decisions be made for all, and will not use their power to oppress, persecute, or otherwise disadvantage the others in society. However, looking back at history, there are plenty of times wherein we can, with the power of hindsight, say that an election contributed to a net negative for a society, whereby constituents' own freedoms, own standards of living, the moral practices of the government, or the treatment of minorities were diminished due to democratic outcomes. Callicles stated in Plato's The Gorgias, "The makers of laws are the majority, and they make laws and distribute praises and censures with a view to themselves and to their own interests." Historical examples of this, which hopefully we can all agree are examples where a clear negative consequence is shown, consist of Germany's November 1932 election, whereby Hitler had secured the largest share of the votes and secured the Reichstag, the German parliament, as well as Robert Mugabe, whom in 1980 won the Zimbabwean popular vote and formed a majority government, Hugo Chavez, whom in 1998 won the Venezuelan popular vote and formed a majority government, and Vladimir Putin, whom in 2012 won the Russian popular vote and formed a majority government. The outcomes of these elections was a collective and indisputable erosion of minority rights, economic freedoms, political freedoms and liberal values as a whole. We need not mention the 12 million who died in the Holocaust, the 7.4 million who have fled their homes in Venezuela as economic migrants, the thousands who died in the Gukurahundi massacres of Zimbabwe, or Russia's political situation, where political opponents to Putin's regime are convicted on abstract charges of extremism and end up dying in prison from a sudden cardiac arrest with no more comorbidity factors. Elections, which are a hallmark of democratic function, thus have the capacity to completely undermine those very democratic functions and values it seeks to uphold when the majority decides it to be so, and thus to avoid becoming a pipeline to tyranny. The very philosophy of democracy fundamentally relies on an assumption that there will never be a majority call for tyranny in the future, an assumption which is ultimately flawed and uninsured other than by checks and balances which as legal abstracts can always be undermined and stripped away. Just ask the Roman Empire how the Roman Republic feels about checks and balances, or the Founding Fathers how they feel about how the US federal government is now the most powerful organization in human history. The overarching lesson here is that democracy is inherently built upon the belief that the majority's opinion is the best decision for all, solely based on the merit of it being the view most widely shared. To those who hold this view, I urge that you look at the aforementioned historical examples. But one such example whereby you need to look no further goes back to ancient Athens itself, at the death of Socrates, to understand why democracy has been flawed from the very beginning. Of course, through historical and contemporary observation of other societies, or our own societies through previous carnations, we can see societies which were or are not democratic. The mind of the average person goes to examples of these which are illiberal, authoritarian, and tyrannical. The mind of the layman goes to examples of North Korea, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and other illiberal tyrannies. The common theme of these examples, which we often think of as the only alternative to democracy, is an overarching diminishment of freedom. It is impossible for someone to imagine a system where freedom is emboldened in the absence of democracy. However, I'll present you with one historical society, which I'm not wholly advocating for, because no society is without its faults, but the summary to be learned here is that democracy is not the only option by which we can organize our society without appealing to authoritarianism. The Icelandic Commonwealth was a medieval-era society which is understood as being stateless, not only without democracy, but without central authority entirely. The Icelandic Commonwealth had a voluntary social contract in the form of their legal code, which one did not have to abide by, but were incentivized to do so through the protection that it offered. Disincentives of acting against the voluntary law code consisted of outlawry, social ostracization, and within-law punishment such as fines. There was no central enforcement mechanism, no use of coercion, and no use of power. Overall, to summarize the Icelandic legal and political system, the social contract was voluntary, and the political system was within the voluntary social contract. Furthermore, political problems did not affect all, as decision-making for one did not have implications for all. Thus, decision-making was fluid and individualistic, avoiding the tyranny of the majority. In regards to economic output of the Icelandic Commonwealth, Peter Leeson, economist from the George Mason University, stated, "The data available for comparing living standards in Iceland and other territories in medieval Europe, data on human height, wages, and population growth are sparse, crude, and therefore challenging to interpret. But a basic picture is apparent nonetheless. Living standards in state-governed medieval Europe do not seem to have been higher than they were in Iceland." So whilst democracy as a philosophy manifests and is practiced in a broader way of systems and societies through the state, meaning that a one-for-one analysis of democracy to its alternatives is practically impossible, there are fundamentals embedded within democracy that promote an erroneous decay of civil liberties pertaining to anything amounting a minority in order to benefit the collective. The dire consequence of this is not just for marginalized groups, whether it be the historical examples of the African American, the European Jew, or more niche groups such as specific socio-economic classes and organizations like unionized workers, or even the business class, but fundamentally, the individual. When society's aims, goals, ambitions, and problems are achieved and solved through democracy, they are achieved and solved through collectivism, which has no uncompromising defense against forming into a draconian tyranny across time. The antidote to this is dependent on a society's capacity to rationalize a world outside the box of democracy, while adhering to the trials and tribulations of history in order to avoid tyranny.